Hello, my name is Olivia. I'm a student of English, and I want to tell you about my life in New York. Learning English was not easy for me at first, but I never gave up. I want to share my journey with you, how I started, the mistakes I made, and how I improved step by step. Now, let me take you on my journey. When I first arrived in New York, I felt like I had stepped into another world. The city was loud, fast, and full of people who spoke a language I barely understood. I had studied some English before coming here, but everything sounded different when I heard people speaking on the streets. They spoke too fast. Their words blended together like one long sentence, and I could not catch anything. I remember standing at the airport, trying to ask for directions to my apartment, but the man at the help desk spoke so quickly that I panicked. I nodded my head, pretending I understood, but inside, I felt lost. The first week in New York was the hardest. I had moved into a small apartment in Queens, sharing it with a roommate named Emily. She was friendly and tried to talk to me, but I struggled to reply. Every morning, she would ask, "How did you sleep?" I knew the words, but my mind froze. Should I say good? Or I slept well? I was afraid of making mistakes, so I just smiled and said, yes. She probably thought I was strange, but I didn't know how to explain that I was too nervous to speak. Outside, the city felt like a big puzzle I couldn't solve. The subway was the most confusing part. The announcements over the speakers were too fast, and I couldn't read the signs quickly enough before the train doors closed. One day, I got on the wrong train and ended up in a part of the city I had never seen before. I wanted to ask someone for help, but I was too shy. I walked around for an hour, looking for a map, until finally I gathered enough courage to ask a woman, "Where train?" She looked confused, and I felt embarrassed. She asked me something, but I didn't understand. My heart was pounding. I just pointed at the subway map, hoping she would understand me. She smiled and said something slowly, but I only caught a few words. I thanked her and walked away, still unsure if I had understood her directions. Grocery shopping was another challenge. I needed eggs, bread, and milk, but I didn't know how to ask for them. The first time I went to the store, I just pointed at things and avoided talking to the cashier. When she asked, "Do you need a bag?" I didn't understand at first. She repeated, "Bag," and held one up. I quickly nodded, feeling embarrassed. These small moments made me feel like I was a child again, learning everything from the beginning. At night, I sat in my room, feeling frustrated. I wanted to talk, but my words felt stuck inside me. I had so many thoughts, but I didn't know how to express them. I felt lonely because I couldn't join conversations. People laughed and talked at school, on the subway, in cafes, but I felt like an outsider. I wanted to be part of the world around me, but my English was a wall separating me from everyone else. One day, I made a big mistake at school. I had joined an English class at a local language center, hoping to improve. The teacher asked me a question, and I thought I understood. I answered, feeling proud, but then the whole class started laughing. My face turned red. The teacher smiled and gently corrected me. I had used the wrong word, and my sentence had a very different meaning. I wanted to disappear. That night, I cried in my room, thinking, maybe I will never learn this language. But even in my sadness, I knew I couldn't give up. I reminded myself why I had come to New York, to learn, to grow, to have a better future. I told myself, tomorrow, I will try again. I didn't know where to start, but I knew one thing. I had to find a way to improve step by step. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep feeling lost every time I stepped outside. I couldn't keep pretending to understand conversations when I didn't. I had come to New York with a dream, to learn English, to grow, to have a better future. But after weeks of struggling, I felt stuck, unable to move forward. I told myself, tomorrow I will try again. But how? Where should I start? The thought of speaking scared me. I didn't want to make mistakes. I didn't want people to laugh at me again. But as I lay there, thinking about all the moments I'd felt embarrassed, I realized something important. The only way to get better was to start small. I didn't need to speak in full sentences right away. I just needed to learn a few simple words and phrases. The next morning, I decided to change my routine. Instead of feeling afraid, I would take small steps. I picked up a notebook and wrote down 5 words. Hello, thank you, sorry bag, and train. These were words I heard often but never used. I promised myself I would use at least one of them that day. I left the apartment and walked to the small cafe near my language school. Normally, I would just point at the menu when ordering, but this time I wanted to say something. I stood in line, repeating the word in my head, hello, hello, hello. When it was my turn, the cashier looked at me, waiting for my order. My heart pounded. I opened my mouth, and for the first time I said hello. It was such a small word, but saying it out loud felt like climbing a mountain. The cashier smiled and said, hello. What would you like? I quickly pointed at a coffee on the menu, feeling too nervous to say anything else. But as I walked out with my coffee, I felt proud. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. That night, I wrote down more words. Water, street, turn left, help, and exit. Every day, I added new words to my notebook. I wrote them in big letters, saying them out loud over and over. I practiced in my room, whispering to myself, water, street, turn left. I sounded silly, but I didn't care. These words were becoming part of me. I started using my new words in real life. At the grocery store, instead of just pointing, I tried to say bag when I needed one. At the train station, I looked for the word exit on signs and whispered it to myself as I walked past. The first time I asked a stranger for directions, I was so nervous that I forgot half the words I had practiced. I said, where? Turn left, street. The man looked confused at first, but then he smiled and pointed the way. It wasn't perfect, but I had spoken. At school, I started paying closer attention. Instead of worrying about full sentences, I focused on catching key words. My teacher would say a long sentence, but I would only pick out the words I understood. Today, learn verbs. That was enough for me to get the idea. Little by little, English was starting to make sense. One evening, my roommate Emily noticed my notebook filled with English words. She picked it up and smiled. You're working really hard, she said. I nodded, feeling shy. Then she asked, want to practice together? At first, I hesitated. Speaking with her felt scary. What if I said something wrong? But then I remembered my promise to myself, to take small steps. So I said, yes. Every night after that, Emily helped me practice. She would point at things in the kitchen and ask, what is this? I would answer cup, spoon, milk. At first, I only said single words, but over time, I started adding more. This is a cup. That is a spoon. I made mistakes, but Emily never laughed. She just repeated the words correctly, and I learned. One day, something surprising happened. I was at the cafe again, waiting for my coffee, when a man in line behind me accidentally bumped into me. He quickly said, sorry. Without thinking, I replied, it's okay. It was the first time English had come out of my mouth naturally, without fear, without thinking. I felt a rush of excitement. I had spoken without freezing. I had responded without hesitation. That night, I sat in my room, looking at my notebook. The pages were now filled with words, phrases, and little sentences. I had started with 5 words, and now I had dozens. I smiled to myself. I was still far from fluent, but I was no longer afraid of English. I was ready for the next step. Learning simple words and phrases had given me a little confidence, but I knew I had a long way to go. My sentences were still short, and sometimes people didn't understand me. But at least I had started. I had spoken, and that was enough to push me forward. One evening, after a long day at my language school, I sat in my small apartment, feeling both tired and determined. I looked at my notebook, now filled with English words and phrases. Learning words was good, but I needed more. I needed to hear English to see it in action. I needed to train my ears and my brain to recognize words faster. That's when I remembered something my teacher had said. Surround yourself with English. The more you hear it, the easier it will become. I picked up my phone and searched for English videos. At first, I found news channels, but they spoke too fast, and I couldn't understand much. Then I found a simple cartoon with subtitles. The characters spoke slowly, and the words appeared on the screen. I pressed play. At first, it was hard. My mind wanted to translate every word into my native language, but that took too long. By the time I understood one sentence, the characters were already saying something new. I felt frustrated, but I didn't stop. Instead, I just listened. Even if I didn't understand everything, I tried to hear the rhythm of the words, the way sentences flowed. After a few minutes, I caught my first familiar word, hello. Then another, thank you. My heart raced with excitement. I was hearing words I knew. That night, I made a new habit. Every evening, I watched something in English, cartoons, short videos, even commercials. I didn't worry about understanding every word. I just listened. A week later, I decided to challenge myself. Instead of watching with subtitles in my native language, I switched to English subtitles. This was harder, but I could see the words as people spoke them. I noticed how they said gonna instead of going to and wanna instead of want to. I realized that spoken English was different from the words in my textbook. One night, as I was watching a video, I heard a phrase that I really liked. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. It stuck in my mind. I thought about all the times I'd stayed quiet because I was afraid of saying something wrong. But now, I understood something. If I didn't try, I would never improve. The next day, I decided to do something scary. I would talk to someone, on purpose. At the cafe near my school, I always saw the same barista. She was friendly and always smiled at me. That day, as I walked in, my hands felt sweaty and my heart was pounding. But I reminded myself, don't be afraid to make mistakes. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath and said, hello. How are you? The barista's eyes lit up. I'm good. How about you? For a moment, my brain froze. I hadn't expected her to ask me anything. But then I quickly remembered the words I'd learned. I'm good. Thank you. It was a short conversation, but it was my first real exchange in English. And I had survived. From that day on, I started talking more. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes I forgot words. Sometimes people didn't understand me. But I didn't give up. I also started listening more carefully when people spoke. On the train, I listened to conversations around me. I didn't always understand, but I caught familiar words. I started noticing common phrases like have a good day and excuse me. I also paid attention to how people expressed emotions. I watched their faces, their hand movements, and how their voices changed. I realized that understanding English wasn't just about words. It was about how people spoke. One day, something amazing happened. I was at the grocery store, and a woman in front of me was looking for something. She asked an employee, where can I find the milk? It was a simple question, but for the first time, I understood everything. Not just a word here and there, but the whole sentence. I walked home that day with a big smile on my face. My listening skills were improving. But I still had one big fear, speaking to strangers. Saying hello to the barista was one thing, but having a full conversation, that felt impossible. Then, an opportunity came. One afternoon, I was sitting alone in a park watching people walk by. A woman sat down next to me. She smiled and said, beautiful day, isn't it? I hesitated. My brain screamed, say something. But what? I took a deep breath and replied, yes, it is nice. She nodded. Are you from New York? I shook my head. No, I am from Argentina. She smiled. Oh, how do you like New York? I want to say so many things, but I didn't know the words. So I kept it simple. I like. It is big. Many people. She understood. Yes, it's a busy city. We talked for a few more minutes. I made mistakes, but she was kind. When she left, I felt proud. I just had my first real conversation with a stranger. After that, I made a rule for myself. Every day, I would say at least one sentence to someone new. I asked the cashier of the store, how much is this? I told the bus driver, thank you. I asked a classmate, where are you from? Speaking was still scary, but the more I did it, the easier it became. And then, one day, something incredible happened. I was waiting at a bus stop when a lost tourist approached me. She looked worried and asked, excuse me, do you know where Central Park is? For the first time, I wasn't the one who needed help. Someone was asking me for directions. I felt nervous, but I reminded myself, don't be afraid to make mistakes. I took a deep breath and answered, yes. Walk straight, then turn left. She smiled. Thank you. As she walked away, I realized something. Just a few months ago, I was the lost person. I was the one struggling to understand, feeling afraid to speak. But now, I was helping someone else. That night, as I sat in my apartment, I felt something new. It wasn't just confidence. It was pride. I had come so far. I wasn't perfect, but I was learning. And most importantly, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready for the next step. After that day at the bus stop, something inside me changed. For the first time since moving to New York, I felt like I belonged. I wasn't just a girl struggling with English anymore. I was someone who could help others. I was someone who could communicate. I still made mistakes, but I no longer let them stop me. But I knew that if I wanted to speak English fluently, I had to practice every single day. I couldn't just wait for random conversations to happen. I had to take control of my learning. So, I made a promise to myself. English would become a part of my daily life. The first thing I did was start talking to myself in English. At first, it felt strange. I was used to thinking in my native language, and switching to English was difficult. But I knew it was important. I started small. When I woke up, instead of thinking, voy a preparar café, I told myself, I'm going to make coffee. When I got dressed, I said, I'm wearing a blue shirt today. When I walked outside, I thought the weather is cold. I need my jacket. At home, I talked to myself out loud. I pretended to have conversations. Sometimes I stood in front of the mirror and said, hello, my name is Olivia. I live in New York. How are you? Other times, I practiced real situations. Before going to a cafe, I would say, I would like a coffee, please. Before going to the store, I practiced, excuse me, where can I find the bread? The more I did this, the easier it became. My brain started to think in English without translating. Words came faster. Sentences felt more natural. And then something interesting happened. One morning, I woke up and my first thought was in English. I need to get ready for school. I didn't translate it. I didn't force it. It just happened. I smiled. I was making progress. I knew that if I wanted to keep practicing every day, I had to make it fun. Learning from books was helpful, but it wasn't enough. I needed English to be a part of my hobbies, my entertainment, and my daily routine. So I changed a few things. Instead of listening to music in my native language, I started listening to English songs. At first, I didn't understand all the words, but I enjoyed the rhythm. I looked up the lyrics and sang along. Instead of watching movies with subtitles in my language, I switched to English subtitles. Then, I challenged myself. Sometimes I watched without any subtitles at all. I also started reading. At first, I chose children's books because they used simple words. Then, I moved to short stories and magazines. I kept a notebook where I wrote down new words and their meanings. One of my favorite ways to practice was through podcasts. I found a podcast for English learners and listened to it every morning while walking to school. The speakers talked slowly, and they explained words I didn't know. It was like having a free English lesson every day. By making English a part of my favorite activities, I never felt bored. Learning became something I looked forward to. Practicing alone was good, but I knew that if I really wanted to improve, I had to speak with real people. That was still my biggest challenge. One day, I decided to join a language exchange group. I found a group where people met once a week to practice different languages. Some people wanted to learn Spanish, and I wanted to learn English. It was perfect. The first time I went, I was nervous. I sat quietly at the table, listening to others talk. Then, someone smiled at me and said, "Hi, what's your name?" I took a deep breath and answered, "My name is Olivia." She asked, "Where are you from?" I replied, "I am from Argentina." She smiled. "Oh, that's great. I'm learning Spanish. Can you help me?" I was surprised. "Yes." I said, "I help you, and you help me." That night, I spoke English more than I had ever spoken before. It wasn't perfect, but I felt comfortable. No one laughed at my mistakes. No one judged me. I kept going to meetings every week. Slowly, I became more confident. I made friends. I started speaking without fear. After a few months of daily practice, I noticed a huge difference. I could understand people better. My sentences were longer. My confidence was growing. But I didn't want to stop there. I wanted to challenge myself even more. So I set new goals. Goal 1. Order food at a restaurant without hesitation. One evening, I walked into a restaurant, sat down, and told myself, "You can do this." When the waiter came, I looked him in the eye and said, "I would like a chicken sandwich and a lemonade, please." No fear. No hesitation. Goal 2. Start a conversation with a stranger. At the bus stop, I saw a woman reading a book. I gathered my courage and said, "That book looks interesting. What is it about?" She smiled and started talking to me. We had a full conversation. Goal 3. Speak English at work. I worked part-time at a store, but I always stayed quiet. One day, I decided to change that. When a customer walked in, I greeted her with confidence. "Hello. How can I help you today?" She didn't even notice that English wasn't my first language. Goal 4. Think only in English for a whole day. This was my biggest challenge. I woke up and told myself, today, I will not use my native language. It was difficult, but I did it. I spoke in English, I wrote in English, and I even dreamed in English that night. By creating small challenges, I kept pushing myself forward. One day, I realized something important. I was no longer learning English. I was living in English. I wasn't just memorizing words. I was using them. I wasn't just listening. I was understanding. I wasn't just practicing. I was communicating. And that was the moment I knew I had become a part of this world. English was no longer a foreign language to me. It was my language, and I was ready for the next step. It had been months since I first arrived in New York, feeling lost in a sea of English words I couldn't understand. But now, things are different. I no longer hesitated before speaking. I no longer avoided conversations. English had become a part of my life. But there was still one thing I needed to work on: confidence. Even though I was speaking more, I still doubted myself. Sometimes I would start a sentence and suddenly stop, afraid I might say something wrong. Other times I would speak too fast, rushing through my words because I was nervous. I wanted to be fluent, but fluency wasn't just about knowing words. It was about speaking with confidence. I knew I had to push myself even more. One of the biggest things holding me back was my fear of making mistakes. I had come a long way, but deep down, I still worried about sounding silly. Then one day, something happened that changed my perspective. I was in a cafe, waiting in line to order coffee. In front of me, there was a man who looked like a tourist. When it was his turn, he hesitated before speaking. He looked at the menu, struggling to find the right words. Then, he slowly said, "I would like, one coffee with milk." His sentence wasn't perfect, but the cashier understood. She smiled and said, "Sure. One coffee with milk. Anything else?" The man nodded and said, "No, that is all." That's when I realized something important. Nobody laughed at him. Nobody corrected him. Nobody cared that his English wasn't perfect. That moment stayed with me. If he could speak without fear, then so could I. From that day on, I stopped being afraid of mistakes. Instead of saying, "What if I say something wrong?" I told myself, "What if I say nothing at all?" It was better to speak imperfectly than not speak at all. Another thing I needed to improve was the way I spoke. I had spent so much time focusing on learning words and phrases that I never thought about how I sounded. One day, I was having a conversation with a classmate, and she said, "I love talking to you, Olivia, but sometimes you speak too fast. I can't understand everything." I was surprised. Too fast. I thought speaking quickly made me sound fluent. But I realized that fluency wasn't about speed, it was about clarity. So, I practiced speaking slowly and clearly. I started reading aloud every day, making sure to pronounce each word correctly. I recorded myself speaking and listened to my voice. I noticed that when I slowed down, my words were stronger and clearer. And the best part? People understood me better. Speaking slowly also made me feel more confident. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I took my time, and that made a huge difference. By now, I was comfortable speaking with friends and classmates. But I wanted to take it a step further. I wanted to speak naturally, like a native speaker. I started paying attention to how Americans talked. I noticed they used a lot of fillers like, "well, you know," and "like." They didn't always use perfect grammar, but they spoke smoothly and naturally. So, I practiced copying their style. Instead of saying, "I do not know," I said, "I don't know." Instead of saying, "Yes, that is true," I said, "Yeah, that's true." Instead of saying, "I'm going to study," I said, "I'm going to study." These small changes made my English sound more natural. I also practiced reacting in conversations the way native speakers did. For example, if someone said, "It's so cold today," I didn't just say yes. I said, "Yeah, I know. I should have worn a warmer jacket." If someone told me a funny story, I didn't just say, "That is funny." I laughed and said, "No way. Are you serious?" If someone asked, "How was your weekend?" I didn't just say, "Good." I said, "It was great. I went to Central Park and saw a street performer. It was amazing." By adding details and expressing emotions, I made my conversations more interesting. And soon, something incredible happened. People stopped noticing that English wasn't my first language. The final step in my journey to fluency was pushing myself out of my comfort zone. I knew I had improved a lot, but I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle any situation in English. So, I challenged myself in new ways. I joined a public speaking club. Standing in front of a group and speaking in English was terrifying at first, but it helped me become more confident. I started making phone calls in English. Talking on the phone was difficult because I couldn't see the other person's facial expressions, but I practiced until I felt comfortable. I made a video in English. I recorded myself telling a story and posted it online. Seeing myself speak fluently gave me a huge confidence boost. Each challenge made me stronger. Each challenge brought me closer to fluency. One evening, I was sitting in a coffee shop, reading a book, when a woman sat down next to me. She looked over and said, "That book looks interesting. What's it about?" Without thinking, I smiled and said, "Oh, it's a mystery novel. It's really exciting. The main character is trying to solve a crime, but there are so many twists and turns." We started talking about books, movies, and our favorite places in New York. And then, in the middle of the conversation, it hit me. I was speaking naturally. I wasn't thinking about grammar. I wasn't translating in my head. I was just talking. That was the moment I realized I was fluent. Fluency wasn't about knowing every word. It wasn't about speaking perfectly. It was about communicating with confidence. When I first arrived in New York, I was scared. I felt alone. I thought I would never be able to speak English fluently. But step by step, I improved. I started with simple words. I listened, watched, and practiced every day. I pushed myself to speak without fear. I made English a part of my life. And finally, I gained the confidence to speak fluently. Now, I don't just speak English, I live in English. And if I can do it, so can you.